Hello, welcome to another edition of Humble Theology. My name is John. In this series, we are looking at the book of Hebrews. We just finished up chapter 7 last time, looking at how Jesus is the fulfillment of the type that Melchizedek represented in the Old Testament. So the comparison made as far back as even chapter 5 and so forth, all the way through to chapter 7, Melchizedek is held up as a type of priesthood that Christ fulfills. And why? Well, because it's better. How is it better? Well, because the Levitical priesthood assigned under Moses, but yet as promised and paid under Abraham to Melchizedek, represents that Melchizedek must have been higher because this Aaronic, Mosaic, Abrahamic covenantal priesthood paid to the better, paid to Melchizedek. So Christ is held up as a better priesthood, a better high priest than these fellows. So now in chapter 8, it picks up on this as in a sermon, or even as you're writing a paper and you get to your summary, so to say, or your thematic point. You've made several analogies, you've made several case points, but now you get to your point. What are you trying to say? And Hebrews chapter 8 brings that out for us. So starting in verse 1, let's just read this first, and then we'll make our comments. So Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. Now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." So here in these first few verses, that not only is Christ typified, or there's a typology in the Old Testament of him in Melchizedek's priesthood, but even in the office of what the tent and temple and all those things meant were also types and shadows of the true. Christ is a minister in heaven, in heavenly places, in a holy place, in the true tent, there in verses 1 and 2. Well, why is that? Well, they just represented something. So verses 3 through 5 make it clear that they represent the service God was to render in and of himself as a member of the Trinity, to himself as God the Father. So the Son is sacrificing and making atonement to appease the wrath and justice of God as in the Father. But again, still it's Trinitarian, so it's affecting and applying to all three. But this is what happens. So those serving as priests here on earth in the Levitical priesthood back in Judaism, that some of these now Christians are considering times are rough. You might want to go back to that system, go back to Judaism. He's saying, no, those priests serve according to the law. And everything that they're doing is just type and shadow of what Jesus really is and what he really did, what he really accomplished before the Father in a very spiritual and really true sense of atonement and sacrifice. Okay, so then let's continue. Verse 6. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. So he's speaking about within the covenant of grace. So there's one covenant of grace, but it's administered, or you could say it's economy, or it's enacted in different ways. So in the Old Testament one way, in the New Testament another. But it's still one covenant of grace. In the Old Testament, it was supposed to be typified in the promises given and the law and the ceremonies and all those things that they had. There was a picture of the gospel, of the grace of God, of those who believed and followed, as we'll get to in the chapter of faith in Hebrews that's coming up. These people in the Old Testament believed just as we do, but they believed in seeing Christ coming. They saw the shadows and types of what he was going to do, whereas we look back at what he actually did. So that's what he's talking about in there being something better coming. Well, if you just have a representation of something to come and it never comes, well, then what was it representing? It was empty. But if it's representing something to come and something comes, well, then you have something better. And so you switch to the better. Jesus speaks of this as like new wine. It's like I can't put new wine in old wineskins, otherwise it bursts, and the old and the new are both ruined. So they're not going to be couched together. In the same way, kind of an illustration, if you're traveling down a road, whatever popular highway is in your area, you may have directions to be on that highway for a certain distance, and then you're supposed to take a certain exit, deviate to a certain road to get to your destination. So it's appropriate to be on that highway for a certain length of time, but then you're to turn. If you never turn and you stay on the highway, it's like, well, I know the highway. I'm familiar with the highway. The highway's the best and widest road. I'll just stay on this. If you never made the turn, then you're on the wrong path, although you started out correctly on it. That's what's happening within Judaism. Judaism, when Christ came, it's, hey, there's going to be a new covenant. The fulfillment's going to come, and these types and shadows are going to pass away. You're going to make a pivot. But no, we're not going to follow this guy. We're not going to pivot. We're not going to follow and say he's the fulfillment of these types and shadows. We're just going to keep on the same path we've always been on. Well, that's a denial of Christ. That's a denial of the way God gave them. And so they're on the wrong path. So the sermon writer here is telling them, if you're not going to follow Christ in his new covenant representation of the covenant of grace, being fulfilled in himself and what he accomplishes on the cross in these heavenly places, then you're on the wrong path. There isn't a secondary path. Well, he'll get back to them later. Well, he'll allow them to make a U-turn. Well, he'll jump back on the road at some other time. It's like, no, they're on the wrong path. The path was to turn and follow the Christ to come. The Christ has come. If you're following him, then yes, you're on the right path. If you're not following him, there's no secondary means. You're on the wrong path. How does he identify this? Well, in verses 8 through 12, we have the Old Testament citation from Jeremiah 31 to 34, which he quotes here roughly. For he finds fault with them when he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will remember their sin no more. So the The sermon writer of Hebrews is saying, look, this was foretold in the Old Testament, not just in this one place in Jeremiah, but in several places, that a new covenant was coming. A new covenant would come and replace the old. And why? Well, because it's fulfillment. It's no longer like the law being given to Moses and all the ceremonies that followed in the Levitical priesthood that they had. He goes, no, but I will come and be with them directly. I will be their God. They will be my people. Christ, God, comes to earth himself and enjoins us to follow and believe on him. The types and symbols and shadows are done away with the coming of the one who fulfills those things. There is nothing to go back to them. So, which he then summarizes in verse 13, the last verse of chapter 8 for today. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So they see Judaism decreasing, Christianity increasing, although there's obviously a ton of persecution. The church has always seemed to grow under the greatest times of persecution. But why can the people who are tired of the persecution, why can they not go back to Judaism? Well, because the type and shadow, the thing typified, the thing casting the shadow, has come. Again, another illustration, kind of like farming. There are appropriate duties in farming to conduct during spring and summer. You plant and you water and harvest, fertilize, all that kind of stuff, maybe even into fall. But once winter comes, you don't do those things. It's obsolete. You have a new task then at hand. Your administration of the farming you would do is changed. You've brought in your harvest, and so now it's that to live off of and other things. You made preparations for what was coming, and now that it's come, you don't continue on the same path. You don't go out in the fields in the wintertime and try to plant seed or till up the icy hard ground or try to water the ground to make it even more icy. So too, the covenant of grace has this other administration that was, again, appropriate under Abraham and Moses through David and the others up until the coming of Christ. When he comes, those types and shadows are fulfilled. He becomes the new, the better covenant to follow. Now, it's still the covenant of grace, but in its better and fulfilled form. So that's what we hold on to, too. I mean, in other groups, not to get too much longer, dispensationalists, they would just say, well, Israel is on the right path and God will rejoin them on the highway at a later time. Once he's done dealing with those who pivoted and turned off on the correct street of following him. It's like, that doesn't make sense, and that's not in Scripture that he returns to them. The argument in Romans that all Judaism would be saved is that they would come around to the correct street. They would change their ways. They would become jealous by those who deviated and turned off. Say, hey, what did they go do? What's going on over there? And they would turn and follow suit. They would, in a sense, make the U-turn and correct themselves and correct their orientation back to Christ. But those who don't are just as lost. Again, if you don't have Jesus, you don't have the Father. So sub-point there. This is running a little longer than I would expect anyway. So that's it for chapter 8. We'll continue with chapter 9 next time. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time. God bless. Bye-bye.